Welcome to Crimson Clues, where shadows hide secrets and silence reveals the truth. Every story is a puzzle, and every clue takes you closer to the answer. Subscribe now, join the hunt, and let the mystery begin. Chapter 1. Golden Horn Summons. The strange circumstances that would finally lead me into one of my buddy Hercule Poirot's most confusing investigations began, as so many significant events do, with the delivery of an urgent letter to my London club. The telegram arrived on a gloomy Tuesday afternoon in March, cutting through the comfortable hum of talk and the gentle rustle of newspapers that usually defined that drowsy hour when gentlemen of leisure planned the evening's pleasures. The letter contained the unmistakable accuracy of wording that distinguished all messages from the small Belgian detective. However, underlying its formal formality came a sense of urgency, indicating that things required immediate attention. My friend Hastings, I find myself in exceptional circumstances here in Istanbul, and I urgently desire your attendance. A most intriguing affair has presented itself, one that promises to test even my little grey cells in ways I did not expect. I encourage you to depart at your earliest convenience and join me at the Pera Palace Hotel, where I have reserved rooms appropriate to the gravity of our investigation. Time is of the essence, mon ami. As your dedicated friend Poirot's confidant and chronicler, through several investigations, I had grown accustomed to such calls. However, the geographical scope of this request stood out to me. Istanbul, that old crossroads where Europe meets Asia, where the ghosts of empires past still murmur amid the minuets and bazaars. Whatever brought my friend to those exotic shores must have been one of the most fascinating of his career. Within 48 hours, I was aboard the Orient Express, a gorgeous vehicle that had become synonymous with international intrigue and sophisticated travel. As the familiar landscapes of Europe gave way to the more exotic panoramas of the Ottoman realms, I found myself thinking about the unique character of my acquaintance with Hercule Poirot. Our collaboration, formed through shared adventures and mutual respect, had evolved into something resembling the bond between a passionate chronicler and his subject. Though I pleased myself that my contributions went beyond mere observation and documentation, the journey provided abundant chance for me to guess on what type of case would have piqued Poirot's interest in that far corner of the civilized world. His reputation had travelled far beyond London's criminal circles, and it was completely feasible that a wealthy expatriate or diplomatic figure had sought him assistance with a matter needing his unique style of rigorous investigation. However, something about the tone of his telegram suggested that the situation was more complicated than a simple theft or family dispute. The train arrived at Siketsi station on a morning when the spring sun cast long dramatic shadows across the cobblestone streets of what the locals still called Stambul. The air was dense with strange smells, exotic spices, strong coffee, and that indefinable blend of sea salt and antiquity that seems to pervade all large ports where civilizations have interacted for millennia. As I made my way through the throngs of people toward the Galata Bridge, my luggage in the capable hands of a cheerful porter who spoke a fascinating mix of Turkish, French, and what I assumed to be Greek, I felt that familiar rush of anticipation that always accompanies the start of one of Poirot's more intriguing investigations. In the midst of exotic splendor, the Pera Palace Hotel stood out as a stronghold of European civilization. Its understated elegance provides a soothing familiarity to those returning from Paris or London. The uniformed doorman, whose English was flawless, escorted me with courteous speed to the famous lift, a technological marvel that had made the hotel a byword for modernity across the continent. As I ascended to the third level, I mused on how ideal the setting was for a professional investigation. Comfortable and refined, yet at the center of mystery and international intrigue. I found my friend in his room, gazing at the large windows that offered a spectacular view of the Golden Horn. He was well dressed as usual, his morning coat ironed to perfection, and his patent leather shoes glistening despite the dusty streets he had undoubtedly walked over during his excursions of the city. Several comprehensive maps of Istanbul were on the writing desk behind him, each annotated with his customary exact remarks in purple ink, a sight that quickly told me that his famed little grey cells were already working hard on whatever challenge had brought him to this ancient metropolis. "Ah, Mong Bong Hastings," he said, turning from the window with apparent joy. "You've made terrific time. "I hope the trek was not too exhausting for a gentleman of your age and disposition." "Not at all, Poirot," I said, gripping his small, well-manicured hand with genuine warmth, despite my intense interest about this unusual summoning. "Even by your notoriously thrifty standards, your telegram was quite brief." "Precises him all, my friend," he added with a small smile. "There are some issues that necessitate the most sensitive management, and telegraphic lines are not always as discreet as one would like. The walls, as they say, have ears, and in a city like this, where east meets west and old secrets are hidden beneath every street, one cannot be overly guarded in one's conversations." He pointed to a chair upholstered in rich burgundy velvet, positioned to take advantage of both the morning light and the breathtaking vista beyond the windows. As I settled up comfortably, Poirot moved with remarkable precision to pour coffee from an exquisite Ottoman service provided by the hotel's obviously fine kitchen. The aroma was rich and deep, with little resemblance to the more recognizable brews of London's clubs and coffee shops. 3 days ago, Poirot started, his green eyes taking on that unique intensity that I had come to identify with the most serious and difficult of his cases. I had an unexpected visit from Inspector Kamal Bey of the Istanbul police force. Hastings, a most intriguing guy, was educated at the Sorbonne, spoke good French, and possessed the rarest of traits in a member of any constabulary: creativity tempered by rigorous skepticism. "And what prompted Inspector Kamal to seek your assistance?" "A death, mon ami. A strange and distressing death that has perplexed local authorities and sparked debate within the expatriate community." Poirot's voice lowered to the somber, measured tone he always used when addressing questions of life and death. "Sir Lionel Harcourt, an English archaeologist with a strong academic repute, was unearthed 3 mornings ago in the ancient Byzantine networks beneath the Sultan Ahmed district. He was discovered by torchlight in the early hours of the morning, his face frozen in an expression of what witnesses described as complete horror. Despite the warm Turkish light beaming through the windows, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Good goodness, how did the poor man die? Ah, that is exactly where the problem takes on its most exciting and baffling elements," he said, returning to his position at the window, staring out at the forest of minarets that interrupted the city's old skyline. "The locals whisper in true fear of what they refer to as the ghost of Istanbul. According to their most treasured legends, a spirit haunts and eventually destroys those who try to disturb the buried secrets of this ancient and fascinating city." "Surely you don't mean to imply that I, Hercule, believe in supernatural vengeance?" "Mon Dieu, no." His mustaches bristled with customary fury at the mere thought. "But I believe most deeply in humanity's unlimited propensity to use superstition and terror as convenient covers for their atrocities." Inspector Kamal, despite his modern education and rational viewpoint, admits to a sense of unease about this specific case that extends beyond professional concerns. I observed my friend's features as he stood silhouetted against the light window, noticing something about his demeanor that suggested this case had affected him more deeply than his matter-of-fact statements might indicate. There was strain in his normally comfortable stance, a touch of genuine confusion that I had rarely seen in our many journeys together. "The inspector has done me the considerable honor of requesting my assistance in this matter," Poirot said, his voice full of both professional pride and real concern. "The local authorities are in a sensitive situation, bound by the populace's deeply held convictions. They are concerned that a thorough probe may be perceived as disrespecting the spirits of the ancestors, which, while possibly superstitious, reflects genuine political wisdom in such a diverse and historically complicated city." "And do you think there's more to this tragedy than spiritual intervention?" "Messenmo." Poirot turned away from the window with a sudden decision, his entire attitude radiating the familiar energy that heralded the start of serious investigation. When Hercule Poirot comes across what appears to be an inconceivable murder, disguised as supernatural revenge, his little grey cells begin to work most vigorously. There are patterns to identify and connections to make. First, human motivations must be understood. Poirot returned to his thorough examination of the maps lying across his writing desk as I stood up to change from my travel-stained attire into something more appropriate for whatever investigations lie ahead. The afternoon light coming through the windows struck the purple ink of his annotations, resulting in patterns that appeared almost supernatural in their accuracy and complexity. a perfect metaphor for the challenge that lay ahead of us in the shadowy depths of this ancient city, where the line between mythology and truth had grown dangerously muddled. Chapter 2. Descent into the Ancient Dark. Inspector Kamal Bey proved to be just as Poirot had described him, a middle-aged gentleman with clever black eyes and a measured bearing who had seen much of the world outside of his own Constantinople. His English, despite the musical cadences of his Turkish origin, was precise and deliberate, indicating that he had received an education that went much beyond the standard requirements of police job. I noticed a strange combination of modern skepticism and ancestral discomfort in his demeanor, which appeared to be common of educated men of his generation, stuck between the rational demands of contemporary life and the weight of centuries of tradition. Our trek to the site of Salianol's strange death took us through the labyrinthine streets of the ancient city, where the rising sun created dramatic shadows between structures that had witnessed the rise and fall of empire. The police car, a recent acquisition, as Inspector Kamal proudly informed us, navigated the narrow thoroughfares with considerable skill, though I noticed our driver crossing himself surreptitiously as we passed certain ancient structures whose significance I could only guess at. "Gentlemen," Inspector Kamal noted as we approached our destination, "I must warn you that what you are about to experience may be unpleasant to anyone unfamiliar with the more atmospheric parts of our city's hidden areas. The system where Salianol met his terrible end is not open to casual visitors, and some of my colleagues would prefer that it remain permanently sealed." The truck came to a standstill next to the towering mass of Hagia Sophia, that wonderful architectural tribute to the city's multifaceted history, with old domes that appear to hover over the surrounding streets like a giant protective presence. Inspector Kamal led us through a series of increasingly narrow passages until we arrived at what appeared to be nothing more than an unremarkable stone building wedged between a carpet merchant's establishment and a dimly lit cafe from which drifted the aromatic smoke of Turkish tobacco and the low murmur of conversation in multiple languages. Inspector Kamal stated that since the finding of Salianol's body, the entrance to the cistern has been shut. He produced a large iron key of obvious age from his coat pocket. "We've taken great care to guarantee that no one disturbs the scene. However, I must admit that maintaining such security in a city where every stone appears to conceal a secret tunnel has proved more difficult than one might anticipate." When the door was opened, it showed a steep stone stairway leading into what appeared to be complete darkness. The air that came to greet us had the peculiar chill of underground caverns, heavy with dampness and reeking of decades. There was something more in the air, a faintly sweet, cloying quality that made me involuntarily draw a shallow breath and wonder what chemical processes were at work in such a setting. Inspector Kamal ignited a strong electric torch, its beam creating a bright cone of white light in the Stygian depths below. As we began our careful descent, each footstep echoing with a hollow sound that spoke eloquently of vast spaces beyond our illumination, I found myself thinking about the countless generations who had taken these same steps, each carrying their own purpose and secrets into the ancient darkness. The stairway appeared to drop through geological eras as well as physical space, with each step leading us further from the present world above and deeper into a realm where time seemed to flow differently. When we finally emerged onto the floor of the system proper, the sight that confronted us left me breathless with amazement. Before us stretched what could only be described as a petrified forest, hundreds upon hundreds of columns disappearing into the darkness beyond our torchlight, each carved with exquisite skill by Byzantine master craftsmen and supporting graceful arches that soared overhead like the ribs of some colossal cathedral. The constant trickling of water from the vaulted ceiling made a sound similar to dispersed applause, while our footsteps caused small ripples across the shallow pools, reflecting our torchlight in wavering hypnotic patterns. This specific system, Inspector Kamal stated, his voice taking on an almost reverent air in the immense room, was built during Justinian's reign, but it was lost for centuries, until recent archaeological research brought it back to light. There are dozens of such reservoirs beneath the ancient city, each one a tribute to the engineering prowess of our Byzantine predecessors. We went deeper into this underground wonderland. Our light beam danced across carved capitals, ornamented with intricate foliage, and worn Greek script inscriptions that told of long-forgotten glory. The mood was both amazing and oppressive. The overwhelming weight of history seemed to push on one's mind with almost physical force, leaving one feeling little in comparison to the triumphs of departed civilizations. "Here," Inspector Kamal declared, halting our modest procession. Zalyanel Harcourt was performing his final excavations next to a portion with many columns surrounded by wooden scaffolding and an astonishing array of archaeological equipment. Even in the dim light of our electric flashlight, the evidence of recent human activity was undeniable. Buckets, brushes, measuring devices, and precisely labeled containers were thrown about, indicating either quick desertion or violent interruption. The earth revealed strong traces of organized excavation activity, including small trenches and meticulously sorted mounds of detritus, indicating the methodical approach of a competent archaeologist. But the stark white chalk imprint on the ancient stone floor drew our quick and sobering attention. That distinctive shape, used by police agencies all throughout the civilized world, to indicate the final resting place of the deceased. Zalyanel was discovered right there, Inspector Kamal continued, his voice dropping to a professional tone as he highlighted the outlined figure by his local guide and interpreter, Theodosia Karakos, when he failed to return to the Pera Palace at the usual time. The woman became frightened and searched all night with the help of other local people before entering the cistern around morning. Poirot had walked away from our small group and was undertaking his usual thorough investigation of the situation. His dark form, occasionally lighted by our torchlight as he moved about his task, appeared almost ethereal in the antique environment. I observed with familiar excitement as he used the unique blend of scientific observation and intuitive intuition that had earned him a reputation throughout Europe. He yelled softly for the lantern, his voice reverberating eerily amid the columns. "Where exactly was it discovered?" Inspector Kamal said, "Just there, Muro," directing our attention to a location about 3 feet from the chalk outline. According to hotel records, it was entirely extinguished despite being filled with fresh oil earlier that evening. Tia, Poirot's distinctive exclamation, appeared to resound indefinitely in the huge area. Most intriguing, and this expression of horror which has been widely highlighted, was conveyed so clearly that it could not be misinterpreted. Inspector Kamal's expression got somber. "Monsieur Poirot, I have been a police officer for over 20 years, and I have seen death in many forms, but I have never seen such absolute fear written on a human face." It was as if Zalyanel had seen something that questioned his fundamental knowledge of the natural universe. Poirot casually offered, "The ghost of Istanbul, perhaps." At that point, a voice emerged from the darkness outside our circle of torchlight. Despite the unmistakable tremor of deep emotion, the voice is rich and melodious. "The ghost is real, monsieur, just like these ancient stones and far more dangerous than any mortal enemy." We all looked toward the source of this unexpected interruption, and Inspector Kamal raised his torch, revealing a woman of around 45 years. Her dark hair, streaked with premature silver, caught the light like polished metal, and her eyes mirrored our torch beam with the depth and mystery of black water. She wore practical clothing appropriate for archaeological investigation, but her bearing and style of talking showed education and cultural sophistication that went beyond professional ability. Inspector Kamal expressed relief. "Allow me to present Theodosia Karakos. She was Sir Lionel's guide and translator during his investigation here, and she made the awful discovery of his bones." As we stood in that historic spot, surrounded by the monuments of a departed empire and the evidence of a current tragedy, I found myself paying close attention to this woman's face, as my experience with Poirot had taught me. There was something in her demeanor, a mix of genuine anguish and what I could only describe as fatalistic acceptance, that hinted levels of knowledge not yet exposed by our study. Chapter 3, The Widow's Story. Our journey from the depths of the Byzantine cistern to the familiar comfort of the Pera Palace Hotel was spent in pensive solitude, with each member of our small group engaged in contemplation of what we had experienced in those ancient depths, the abrupt transition from that timeless, underground cathedral to the elegant modernity of the hotel's marble-columned lobby felt almost jarring, as if we had traveled not only through physical space, but through the centuries themselves, emerging from the shadowed past into the bright uncertainty of the present. The unusual circumstances surrounding Lionel Harcourt's death had already piqued the interest of the expatriate community, which had made the Pera Palace its unofficial headquarters. As we passed through the lobby, I noticed the discreet conversations that came to a halt when we approached, as well as the meaningful glances exchanged between well-dressed guests who clearly understood that we represented an official investigation into the incident that had sparked diplomatic Istanbul, talking in hushed, excited tones. For Inspector Kamal had arranged for us to meet the various parties, whose lives had become entangled with the deceased archaeologist's final expedition in the hotel's ornate Ottoman salon. That magnificent chamber, with gilt mirrors reflecting infinite perspectives and Persian carpets whose intricate patterns appear to tell stories of their own. As we settled into comfortable armchairs near the tall windows that provided a spectacular view of the Bosphorus, where merchant vessels and fishing boats continued their eternal dance between two continents, I found myself applying the careful attention to detail that years of association with Hercule Poirot had taught me to use when observing my fellow humans. Lady Margaret Harcourt was the first to appear, and she entered the salon with a presence that would have demanded attention in any drawing room from Mayfair to Europe's courts. She was a woman of about 45 years old, with the kind of refined beauty that improves rather than fades with age. Her auburn hair had just the tiniest silver strands at the temples, which were arranged with perfection, indicating that she paid close attention to her personal appearance, especially given her current circumstances. Her physique, draped in the best black silk money could buy, maintained the exquisite proportions that spoke of high breeding and meticulous physical care. However, it was her manner and demeanor that struck me the most deeply during our initial meeting. Lady Margaret moved with the controlled grace of someone who had spent her entire life in the upper echelons of society. Her every action reflects a lifetime spent managing the intricate social constraints of the British upper classes. Her calm in the face of what must have been a devastating personal loss exhibited a tremendous strength of character, implying levels of resilience that circumstances had clearly forced she cultivate and deploy. "Gentlemen," she said as Inspector Kamal made the necessary introductions with the formality that such occasions demanded, "I am most grateful for your attention to this tragic matter, though I confess to being perplexed as to why the local authorities should require additional assistance in what appears to be a supernatural occurrence beyond the scope of ordinary criminal investigation." Poirot's perfectly groomed eyebrows raised slightly in response to this unexpected observation. "You believe, madam, in the veracity of this Istanbul ghost that has caught the imagination of the locals?" Lady Margaret responded with admirable directness, settling herself elegantly into a chair upholstered in blue Damascus silk that complemented her pale complexion. "And the evidence, as I understand it, from the authorities' preliminary findings, indicates that my husband encountered something in those old chambers that no earthly agency could conceivably have generated. Perhaps you would be so kind as to enlighten us about your late husband's recent archaeological endeavors," Poirot asked, with that gentle insistence that I had come to recognize as his method of encouraging confidences while appearing to be simply conversational. "We are told that Lionel made a particularly significant finding during his present investigation." Lady Margaret's face underwent a subtle alteration throughout this inquiry, and for the first time since her arrival, her carefully maintained serenity appeared to slip somewhat, giving glimpses of the complicated emotions that lurked beneath her public facade. "Lionel was obsessed, perhaps not a strong enough word," she began, her voice taking on a remembered intensity. "For the previous 18 months, he had been following what he described as a series of interconnected clues that he was confident would lead to one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of our century, if not of any century since the Renaissance masters began their systematic exploration of classical antiquity. And the nature of this discovery, madame, artifacts and inscriptions directly related to Constantine the Great himself," she said, her voice warming with what I recognized as enthusiasm for her husband's devotion. Lionel was convinced that he had discovered references to what he called personal cash items and treasures that the emperor had hidden away during the turbulent early period of the city's founding, when political circumstances necessitated extreme discretion regarding the imperial household's most valuable possessions. The historical significance of such a discovery were immediately clear, and I found myself feeling some of the elation that must have motivated Cyanil's final attempts. However, Poirot's next query directed our focus to more practical problems. Lady Margaret's carefully kept serenity clenched visibly at this direct question into what were clearly serious family concerns. Her remark, however, exemplified the same commendable candor that had marked her previous statements. "I will not try to fool you on this point, Mamsie Poirot, because I believe your research will disclose the truth regardless of my personal inclinations. My husband's archaeological studies had depleted our family's financial resources over the course of several years. We had to mortgage our Yorkshire estate in order to dispose of family heirlooms that had been passed down through generations. This revelation was not only an academic accomplishment, but it also saved us from financial ruin." The candor of this disclosure struck me as both admirable and surprising, given the inherent reticence of people of her social position to discuss such personal financial issues with strangers. However, there was something in her demeanor, perhaps a deliberate precision in her word choice, that hinted to unreleased information. "Regarding the evening of your husband's death," Poirot continued with the same mild persistence, "might I inquire as to your own whereabouts and activities during the relevant hours?" "Certainly. I dined here in this very salon with several other guests whom I had met during our stay at the hotel," she replied without hesitation. "Mrs. Patterson, the wife of the American consul, and Colonel Whitmore, who travels in connection with the Imperial Ottoman Bank's local operations. Our supper ended around 9, and I retired to my suite shortly after, where I remained until I received word of the awful finding the next morning." Had Cyanil indicated any specific appointments or engagements that evening? "Is there a specific reason for entering the system after darkness fell?" For the first time, Lady Margaret was astonished by a question, and I had the impression that we had touched on a part of the affair that she had not completely addressed. "He seemed unusually excited about something during our lunch that day," she remarked carefully. "He explained that someone had approached him about an inscription, a new discovery that could have a huge impact on his own studies. However, Lionel had a tendency to keep his work a secret until he was assured of his conclusions." Lady Margaret left the salon a few minutes later, gliding with the same controlled grace that had distinguished her arrival, and I found myself eyeing her disappearing form with distinctly worried thoughts. Her explanation had been admirably plain. However, something about her carefully managed comments hinted at depths yet to be explored in this increasingly convoluted affair. Chapter 4. Rivals and Beneficiaries. The rest of the afternoon saw a stream of characters enter the beautiful salon of the Pera Palace. Each arrival added to the already intricate investigation. As a long-time observer of the subtle interplay of human relationships in various social circles, I found myself peculiarly well positioned to appreciate the delicate tensions that existed among this particular assembly of individuals whose lives had become entangled with Sir Lionel Harcourt's final archaeological endeavors. Professor Rami Fendi was the second individual to appear for Poirot's interrogation, and his mere presence provided valuable insight into the complex cultural issues that surrounded our investigation. He was a man of around 55 years old, carrying himself with the dignity of someone who has dedicated his life to scholastic pursuits while remaining deeply connected to his Turkish ancestry. His Western-style outfit was perfect. However, something about his demeanor revealed the delicate balance that educated men of his generation were forced to strike between the demands of international academic discourse and the underlying cultural commitments that molded their fundamental worldview. Messier began by speaking English with the precise formality of someone who saw it as a carefully acquired ability rather than a native tongue. "I understand you're looking into the circumstances surrounding the death of Lionel High Court. While I naturally want to assist the authorities in any way I can, I must admit that certain aspects of this investigation are profoundly upsetting to me as someone who has dedicated his career to preserving his country's historical patrimony." Professor Effendi's academic background was impressive. A doctorate from the Sound, considerable publication in archaeological journals across Europe, and a reputation for uncompromising intellectual integrity that garnered him respect, even among those who disagreed with his increasingly nationalist views on the disposition of Ottoman artifacts. However, it was precisely this combination of scholastic accomplishment and cultural zeal that made him such an intriguing topic to study. "Do you have reservations about Salion's job?" Poirot queried, in that deceptively casual tone that often elicited the most illuminating confessions. "I was deeply concerned about the systematic removal of our cultural treasures by foreign archaeologists who have little regard for the historical context that gives these items their actual significance." Professor Effendi responded, his voice bearing overtones of barely contained emotion. Salionel was far not the worst of his kind, but his latest discoveries threaten to continue a pattern of cultural plunder that has plagued European archaeological efforts in our region for far too long. The intensity with which he talked was undeniable. However, I noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he related the famous curse that reportedly encircled the system excavations. Something about his demeanor suggested that his hostility to foreign archaeological work was fueled by real concern about the mystical forces linked with such old disruptions. Our next visitor offered a stark contrast to the professor's scholarly earnestness. Captain Julian Rhodes entered the salon with the air of a man used to command. His towering, weathered build and direct style of speech quickly identified him as a product of British military heritage. However, beneath his confident exterior, I detected signs of the financial pressures that had seemingly driven him to seek profit through archaeological speculation. "Gentlemen," he stated without preamble, "I understand you're investigating poor Harrot's death. Damn bizarre stuff if you ask me, but I imagine there will be a sensible explanation once all the facts are known." Captain Rhodes had distinguished himself in some of the Empire's most difficult colonial operations, before retiring to pursue a series of commercial endeavors with mixed results. His choice to fund Solion's recent excavations represented what he freely admitted was his last chance to avert financial ruin. When Poirot inquired about the specifics of their partnership, he answered that the arrangement was basic. "I provided cash for equipment, permissions and local labor, which are realistic prerequisites that researchers frequently overlook when pursuing their theories. In exchange, I was to receive a sizable portion of any revenues from the sale of whatever items were unearthed." The captain's financial condition was clearly fragile, and his investment in Salionel's work marked a significant risk based on desperation rather than rigorous calculation. Yet there was something in his demeanor, a soldier's sense for evaluating risky circumstances, that indicated that he had legitimate doubts about the logic of continuing the excavations in the face of rising local opposition. "There had been some occurrences, you see," he explained, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone used to delivering military reports. "Locals following Hardcourt through the bazaars, violent demonstrations at the excavation sites, and the entire ghost business had the population quite agitated, and I'd begun to wonder if the prospective earnings justified the risks we were taking." The third member of our afternoon's ensemble of characters turned out to be the most exciting in terms of pure academic competitiveness. Miss Evelyn Trent arrived at the appointed time, and her entrance commanded attention through sheer intellectual presence rather than conventional feminine appeal. She was a woman of about 35 years old, with the kind of sharp-featured loveliness that suggests tremendous brains and barely veiled ambition. Miss Trent's qualifications were impressive under any circumstance. A Girton College, Cambridge, fellow with substantial field expertise in Mediterranean archaeological investigations. Her current presence in Istanbul is allegedly related to her own studies into Byzantine religious items. However, something in her demeanor suggested objectives that went beyond strictly academic pursuits. I must admit that Sionel's latest assertions about his discoveries have sparked great mistrust among some members of the archaeological community. She commented with the kind of perfectly calibrated diplomatic phrasing that academic rivalries frequently use to conceal more basic differences. Many of us thought his beliefs about Constantine's personal treasure cache were just too handy, given his well-known financial woes. Her comment had strong connotations, yet it was stated with enough delicacy to avoid a straightforward accusation of scholarly fraud. Miss Trent's own career had been overshadowed by Salion's more spectacular findings, and her carefully calibrated attacks of his latest work revealed an unmistakable sense of professional envy. "Had you examined any of the materials that Sir Lionel claimed to have discovered?" Poe inquired with apparent casual attention. "He was remarkably secretive about sharing his findings with other scholars," Miss Trent said, and for the first time, her calm demeanor revealed true displeasure. Despite repeated appeals from me and others, he insisted on carrying out his analysis in total isolation, stating that premature disclosure could jeopardize the integrity of his findings. This habit of secrecy appeared to frustrate numerous members of the archaeological community, resulting in tensions that went beyond professional dispute. Miss Trent's presence in Istanbul during the closing weeks of Salion's work was definitely not coincidental, while her specific objectives remained mysterious. As the afternoon shadows spread across the Golden Horn and our numerous interviews came to a close, I found myself musing on the complicated web of relationships that surrounded the deceased archaeologist in his final days. Each of our visitors had the motivation and chance to wish Salion ill. However, none had demonstrated the type of evident guilt that could have aided our investigation. Instead, we were left with a group of people whose public utterances obscured depths of hidden motive that would take tremendous effort to uncover. The ghost of Istanbul appeared to have killed a man whose life had gotten intertwined with intellectual rivalry, financial desperation, and cultural conflicts that represented the larger tensions of our changing globe. It was unclear if Sir Lionel High Court was the victim of supernatural retribution or human malice, but the complexities of the situation hinted that Hercule Poirot's famed little grey cells would encounter a test worthy of their reputation. Chapter 5. The Science of Superstition. The following morning, Poirot was in a contemplative mood, eating his breakfast with the painstaking precision that had always defined his approach to hard situations. I watched him from across our shared table in the hotel's exquisite dining room, noting how his green eyes moved with meticulous care between the many Turkish newspapers set out before him and the detailed notes he had taken during our previous day's interviews. The morning light coming through the tall windows overlooking the Bosphorus appeared to spotlight not only his familiar features, but also the distinct aspect of cerebral intensity that signaled the start of his most serious research efforts. "Mon ami," he noticed, without glancing up from his meticulous examination of what appeared to be a medical report written in French. "I'm becoming increasingly convinced that the supernatural explanation for Salionol's death obscures rather than illuminates the exact circumstances of his passing. The human mind has an amazing ability to accept mysterious theories when the mundane truth is too difficult to contemplate. My own past as a military officer had given me valuable expertise seeing the impact of many sorts of violence on the human body. However, I must admit that the precise symptoms stated in the earliest police reports regarding Salion's illness struck me as rather peculiar. The victim's posture at the moment of discovery, clutching his chest in obvious anguish, mixed with his face of complete horror, revealed something more than simple physical assault or even poisoning. "What manner of consultation are you pursuing this morning?" I queried, noticing the official seal on a few of the documents that cluttered our table. Dr. Mahmoud Pasha Poirot, the city's most distinguished physician and a gentleman whose medical education includes both European scientific methods and extensive familiarity with the various toxicological traditions of the Orient, responded, finally raising his eyes to meet mine with the characteristic directness that always accompanied his most significant revelations. "His preliminary inspection of Salionol's remains has given findings of great significance to our investigation. Poirot later said that the doctor's assessment confirmed some key aspects discovered during our study of the crime scene. The victim's symptoms, the rigid posture, the face of dread, and the apparent respiratory trouble all pointed to chemical poisoning, not supernatural intervention. More specifically, the research indicated that exposure to a gaseous toxin resulted in a rapid onset of symptoms, culminating in cardiac arrest. Most interestingly, Hastings," Rowe continued, his voice taking on a distinct sense of satisfaction that indicated great progress in his deductive process. "Is Dr. Mahmoud correct in his observation of the peculiar odor that appeared to linger near the body? The subtle aroma of bitter almonds was evident to someone who had been educated to recognize numerous poisonous compounds." This detail quickly reminded me of my basic knowledge of hazardous substances gained during military service in areas where such information was useful. The almond aroma suggested cyanide, but the process by which such a drug could have been delivered within the limitations of an ancient system remained unknown. Our morning investigations led us to the modest establishment that served as Salional's archaeological workshop, a ground-floor space in one of the newer buildings, near the Galata district that had been outfitted with the various scientific instruments and reference materials required for the analysis of historical artifacts. The proprietor, an elderly Greek gentleman named Stavros, who had clearly developed a high regard for British archaeological methods, greeted us with the kind of deferential courtesy that suggested both genuine admiration for scholarly pursuits and astute recognition of the commercial benefits of maintaining good relationships with foreign researchers. The session itself proved to be an intriguing investigation into the junction of ancient secrets and modern scientific methodologies. Tables filled with carefully catalogued pottery fragments, stone inscriptions and metalwork demonstrated Salion's modern, systematic approach. More importantly for our goals were the numerous chemical supplies used in the preservation and examination of archaeological material. Salional was very meticulous about his scientific techniques, as Stavros described in heavily accented English, pointed to an astonishing array of bottles, retorts, and measuring apparatus. He always insisted on using the right chemical treatment to clean and preserve ancient items. Very knowledgeable dude, very cautious with hazardous items. Poirot examined these supplies and discovered a large variety of acids, solvents, and other compounds that required significant expertise to handle properly. Several chemicals were of particular interest because they may be dangerous if misused, including those that could potentially be utilized to generate hazardous gases under the right conditions. "So you observe," Hastings, Poirot muttered, as he examined a collection of chemical bottles with his customary attention to detail, that our archaeologist possessed both the expertise and the resources required to manufacture a highly powerful poison gas. Should he have taken this course of action? The question that arises is, if he was the victim of his own scientific competence being used against him, by someone who understood both his techniques and actions. This line of thinking became very intriguing when we realized that Salion was not the only archaeologist who used these facilities. Miss Evelyn Trent, according to Stavros, was a frequent visitor to the workshop in the weeks preceding the tragedy, apparently to peruse various reference books and occasionally borrow equipment for her own research projects. The proprietor remarked with admiration that the lady was well versed in chemical processes. She frequently discussed with Salion the right ways for evaluating antique metal artifacts and stone carvings. They had a very knowledgeable conversation. However, they occasionally disagreed on how to interpret the data. Pooh was aware of the consequences of Miss Trent's acquaintance with both the workshop's chemical supplies and Sinel's study procedures. Her competence in archaeological chemistry, along with her clear professional rivalry with the deceased, raised possibilities that needed to be carefully considered. Furthermore, her extensive knowledge of the local dig sites gained through her own research activities would have equipped her with the type of geographical familiarity required for plotting a crime in the labyrinthine corridors beneath the old city. Our afternoon was spent carefully exploring the mythological foundations upon which the ghost of Istanbul had developed its terrifying reputation among the locals. Despite her obvious reservations about what she saw as perilous investigations into supernatural issues, Theodosia Karakos proved to be an excellent guide to the complicated legends surrounding ancient systems and their alleged otherworldly residents. The stories date back many generations, she explained. As we sat in a traditional coffee shop near the main market, the perfumed smoke from water pipes provided an excellent backdrop for her narration of local rituals. Deaths have always occurred in the old places beneath the city. Strange deaths that couldn't be explained by conventional methods. People would walk into the cistern and emerge with stories of awful smells, voices in the darkness, and images that drove them insane. According to Theodosia, the historical record contained numerous stories of strange mortality associated with underground excavations that had taken place intermittently over the centuries. In many cases, the symptoms described were strikingly similar to those that had defined Salion's dying moments. Sudden beginnings of respiratory trouble, emotions of intense anxiety, and the persistent presence of an odd stench that defied easy explanation. But what struck me as most important, Mummy, Poirot noticed as we made our way back to the hotel, through streets where the lengthening shadows of late afternoon created patterns of light and darkness that seemed to mirror the complexity of our investigation. Not the supernatural elements of these stories, but their scientific accuracy in describing the effects of specific chemical compounds on the human system. It appears that someone with extensive understanding of both local folklore and modern toxicology has combined the two traditions to develop the most effective technique of murder. The evening found us in Poirot's apartment, where he had organized the many bits of evidence and testimony in the methodical manner that always preceded his most brilliant deductive attempts. The physical materials, images of the crime scene, chemical analysis reports and witness statements were laid across the writing desk in patterns that reflected his meticulous approach to solving complicated riddles. As I watched my friend prepare for what I suspected would be the most important phase of our investigation, I couldn't help but think about the strange circumstances that had led us to this ancient crossroads between East and West, where centuries of accumulated wisdom had become entangled with the ambitions and rivalries of our modern age. The ghost of Istanbul, whether supernatural or human, had chosen its victim with precision and struck with sophistication, implying careful planning and intimate knowledge of both the scientific principles involved and the cultural context that would provide the perfect camouflage for murder. Chapter 6. Footprints in Mud. By this point, the strange circumstances surrounding Sir Lionel Harcourt's death had become complicated enough to puzzle even the most seasoned detective. As a retired military officer with extensive experience observing subtle patterns that frequently emerge in seemingly chaotic situations, I became increasingly fascinated by Poirot's methodical approach to extracting order from what appeared to be an inexplicable supernatural occurrence. On the morning of our fourth day in Istanbul, my friend was in a very focused mood. His meal was taken with the mechanical precision that always preceded his most intense periods of deductive investigation. He had spent the previous evening carefully studying the numerous physical evidence acquired from the crime site, treating each detail with the systematic thoroughness that had earned him a reputation in European criminal investigative circles. Mon ami, he noted as we prepared to return to the site of Sir Lionel's tragic death, I'm more convinced that the solution to this problem resides not in supernatural intervention, but in the deliberate application of scientific concepts by someone with both the knowledge and drive to use them for deadly ends. Our fall into the Byzantine system on this occasion was motivated by Poirot's meticulous review of the crime scene images. Inspector Kemal, who had proven himself to be an excellent collaborator despite his obvious reservations about the legendary aspects of our investigation, had arranged for the installation of additional electric lighting, allowing for a more thorough examination of the physical evidence than was possible during our initial visit. The forest of ancient columns, now illuminated by the steady glow of electric bulbs placed along temporary cables, looked very different from the murky, torchlit cavern we'd initially encountered. The greater visibility highlighted features that had previously escaped our notice. Subtle differences in the stone flooring, patterns of water damage and mineral deposits that spoke of millennia of gradual alteration, and, most importantly for our purposes, a series of marks and impressions in the accumulated silt that testified to recent human activity. These footprints captured Poirot's quick and prolonged attention. Using techniques he appeared to have learned through correspondence with certain French criminologists who specialized in the scientific analysis of physical evidence, he proceeded to make careful measurements and detailed sketches of the various impressions that marked the route between the system's entrance and the location where Sir Lionel's body was discovered. "Observe, Hastings," he added, crouching down to a particularly obvious set of impressions near the chalk outline that still indicated the victim's final resting place. These footprints convey a fascinating story for those who understand their significance. The following study highlighted Poirot's amazing ability to extract critical information from seemingly insignificant details. The pattern of impressions indicated not one, but multiple separate sets of footprints, indicating that Sir Lionel was not alone in the system during his final hours. More importantly, The depth and clarity of certain impressions suggested that at least one person had moved through the area with considerable familiarity, avoiding softer patches of sediment that would have left deeper tracks and taking a route that suggested intimate knowledge of the underground passages. The murderer, Poirot stated as he finished his measurements, was well versed in the subterranean terrain. Observe how these prints adhere to the firmest ground, avoiding locations where deeper impressions would have been left. This indicates that someone has spent significant time exploring these passages, documenting their layout, and determining the most efficient pathways through the convoluted regions. The consequences of this discovery were instantly clear. Only anyone participating in archaeological work in the area would have had the detailed knowledge of the system geography that the footprint evidence revealed. Miss Evelyn Trent's research pursuits had obviously taken her into these underground regions on several times, giving her with precisely the type of specialized expertise required for the meticulous planning and execution of such a murder. Our investigation took a distinctly scientific turn when Poirot used his extensive understanding of chemistry to reconstruct the likely sequence of events that led to Sir Lionel's death. The data pointed to a highly sophisticated method, the deliberate creation of hydrogen cyanide gas via a controlled chemical reaction, designed to take advantage of the system's isolated environment. The perpetrator, Poirot stated as we inspected the numerous chemical residues discovered in the area of the crime site, used a strategy that required both significant scientific understanding and meticulous advanced planning. Anyone with access to the archaeological workshop might have easily obtained the materials required for such a reaction. However, the practical use required a high level of experience in handling risky compounds. The method's apparent impossibility was what made it so appealing from a criminal standpoint. The production of deadly gas in a restricted location, followed by the natural dispersal of evidence via the ventilation systems, would have left minimal physical evidence of premeditated murder. Only the lingering aroma of bitter almonds discovered by the examining physician's keen senses offered the critical clue, pointing to human agency rather than supernatural intervention. Miss Trent's competence in archaeological chemistry, as evidenced by her published studies and regular use of the workshop facilities, qualified her as the person most capable of devising and carrying out such a sophisticated murder procedure. Her familiarity with the area dig sites, gained during months of personal study, had supplied her with the geographical information required to navigate the underground corridors and determine the best position for her fatal experiment. Our meticulous examination of the academic rivalries that defined the archaeological community's reaction to Sir Lionel's recent finds revealed the motivation that drove her to such desperate measures. His announcement about the Constantine treasure threatened to permanently eclipse her own career achievements, reducing her from a respected scholar to a footnote in archaeological history. For someone whose entire professional identity was based on academic recognition and scholarly reputation, such a prospect indicated a type of professional death that could easily justify actual murder. Poirot's psychological profile revealed an individual whose mix of scientific competence and professional desperation had provided the ideal conditions for a very sophisticated crime. Miss Trent's meticulous cultivation of the supernatural explanation, as well as her strategic use of local tradition to conceal her scientific method, revealed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that went far beyond academic training. As we prepared to leave the cistern following our thorough inspection of the physical evidence, Poirot remarked that the ghost of Istanbul was, in fact, a creation of human intelligence, albeit not in the way that local tradition might suggest. Our assassin used the city's famous reputation to create the perfect cover for a crime that combined ancient superstition and current scientific understanding. The timing of the murder had been carefully planned, taking advantage of Salion's covert working techniques and willingness to investigate intriguing leads without notifying others of his exact intentions. Miss Trent's note, claiming to reveal a new inscription of possible value to his studies, had supplied the ideal lure to entice him into the remote surroundings, where her well-planned trap awaited. As we emerged from the underground realm of Byzantine engineering into the familiar bustle of Istanbul's modern streets, I was struck by the astonishing mix of old and new that had defined this most peculiar murder. The old systems designed to meet the practical needs of a gone empire have become the setting for a totally modern tale of professional competition and scientific murder. The ghost of Istanbul, stripped of its otherworldly mystery, revealed itself to be a product of human ambition and intellectual brilliance, forces that proved just as terrible as any fabled curse. Chapter 7. The Unraveling, the unique talent of criminal investigation. As I had learnt from my lengthy relationship with Hercule Poirot, his work often resembled that of an archaeologist, with each meticulously dug piece contributing to a greater pattern that can only be seen by rigorous inspection of seemingly unrelated fragments. As we approached what I expected to be a critical phase of our Istanbul investigation, I found myself ruminating on the extraordinary turnaround in my understanding of Sir Lionel Harcourt's death. What had begun as an apparent supernatural occurrence, veiled in an ancient city's mystical traditions, had progressively revealed itself to be a totally modern, sophisticated crime. The ghost that tormented Byzantine systems was real, but it existed in the calculating mind of a murderer who used scientific knowledge with lethal precision to create the illusion of otherworldly revenge. The morning of our 5th day in Istanbul, Poirot was in that state of intense intensity that often preceded his most spectacular revelations. He had spent the previous evening carefully reviewing all of the evidence we had acquired, organizing and rearranging the many pieces of testimony and physical proof with the painstaking precision of a master chess player contemplating the last moves of a game. I watched him from my seat near the windows of our apartment, noting how his green eyes darted with purpose between his notebook and the comprehensive floor plans of the system that he had sketched during our inspection. He declared mon ami without looking up from his papers, "I feel the time has come to test some of the possibilities that have emerged as a result of our research. The moment has come to see how our various suspects react when presented with difficult truths regarding their actions during the period preceding Sir Lionel's death." Poirot's tactics in the hours that followed displayed his deep understanding of human psychology and the delicate skill of obtaining critical information from seemingly casual talk. Rather than conducting formal interrogations, which could have elicited defensive responses, he chose to stage a series of seemingly coincidental encounters that would allow him to observe our suspects' natural reactions when presented with carefully selected revelations about the status of our investigation. Our first opportunity came during the morning promenade hour, when the stylish inhabitants of the Pera Palace traditionally convened in the hotel's exquisite lobby to share gossip and conduct the subtle social transactions that were the foundation of expatriate community life. Miss Evelyn Trent was present, as Poirot had predicted, and was engaged in serious conversation with other members of the archaeological community, who had gathered to discuss the ramifications of Sir Lionel's death for ongoing research in the region. "Ah, Miss Trent," Poirot observed casually as we neared her group, "I hope you found time to continue your own research, despite the unfortunate circumstances that have interrupted the intellectual community here. I believe that your research on Byzantine religious items necessitated substantial excavation of the city's underground chambers. The impact of this seemingly simple observation was instantaneous and telling. Miss Trent's serenity, which had been brilliantly maintained throughout our official interview, exhibited the first signs of strain as she recognized the implications of Poirot's remarks. Her understanding of the system, which she had probably thought would stay private, had clearly become a source of government concern. "I have spent a significant amount of time researching the archaeological value of numerous subterranean sites," she responded with care, yet I detected a subtle tightness in her voice that had not been present during our earlier visit. "The preservation of objects in such settings frequently provides unique insights into historical activities and religious beliefs." Prime Poo concurred with evident delight, and I believe that such prolonged exploration would have given you a thorough understanding of the topography of these underground places. "N'est-ce pas? It's almost as if you could navigate them without looking." Miss Trent's cheeks flushed in response to this proposal, proving Poirot's deduction correct. Her extensive knowledge of the underground tunnels gained during months of personal research, led her to travel through those murky places with the confidence of someone who knew every column and archway. Our next encounter was with Captain Rhodes, who we found in the hotel's smoking room, morosely contemplating his financial concerns over a glass of brandy, indicating that the early hour had not discouraged him from seeking liquid consolation for his problems. The captain's military training had supplied him with the kind of practical expertise that could have been valuable in preparing a difficult operation. However, our analysis uncovered critical deficiencies in his comprehension of scientific principles, which would have been required for the procedure used in Sir Lionel's murder. Captain Poirot watched as we joined him at his secluded table. "I understand that your cooperation with Sir Lionel has reached a critical point in recent weeks. The success or failure of his current excavations would have affected your own financial future, wouldn't it?" Captain Rhodes looked at us with the steady stare of someone used to confronting hard truths with military directness. "To put it frankly, I was banking on Harcourt's discovery to get me out of a bad situation. His death has placed me in a terrible financial position. Nonetheless, you began to question the prudence of continuing the excavations in light of the local hostility and the mystical elements that appear to surround the endeavor. A soldier learns to identify when a situation has become untenable," the captain said, with candor that I thought impressive given the circumstances. The local community was growing increasingly antagonistic, and there were indications that our actions were attracting the wrong kind of attention. I began to wonder if discretion might not be the greater part of valor. This conversation confirmed our assessment that, while Captain Rhodes had a strong motive for murder, he lacked both scientific expertise and detailed knowledge of local conditions required for the sophisticated crime that claimed Sir Lionel's life. His clear military mindset was unsuitable for the type of intricate deception that characterized the murder, and his obvious financial desperation would have pushed him toward more direct methods of settling his issues. The critical test of our beliefs occurred following an apparently fortuitous encounter with Professor Rami Effendi in the hotel lobby, where he was involved in an impassioned debate with several Turkish authorities about the cultural consequences of foreign archaeological activities. The professor's strong nationalism and genuine concern for the preservation of Ottoman heritage had given him both motivation and opportunity. However, our analysis discovered anomalies in his actions that indicated complexities beyond basic patriotism. Professor Poirot noted with his usual directness, "Your deep understanding of local legend around Istanbul's ghost has struck me the most. Your acquaintance with the traditional legends related with the ancient cisterns indicates extensive investigation into these topics." Professor Effendi's response to this discovery exposed the basic paradox that had perplexed us throughout our research. Despite his strong resistance to foreign archaeological endeavors and deep respect for indigenous traditions, his scholarly background had left him suspicious of supernatural explanations for visible events. When explaining the famous ghost, his trembling palms revealed not a true fear of otherworldly involvement, but rather the anxiety of someone who recognized that what others attributed to supernatural vengeance was actually human agency. He responded diplomatically, stating that old myths have crucial cultural functions. Even when approached strictly academically, they embody generations of wisdom and deserve respect, regardless of one's personal ideas about their literal veracity. This interaction reinforced our growing belief that Professor Effendi possessed the passion and intellectual capacity for complicated planning. His inherent honesty and academic integrity made him an unusual candidate for Sir Lionel's murder, which was characterized by intricate deception. His nationalism, although intense, remained within ethical limitations that would have prevented such drastic methods. As the afternoon shadows spread across the Golden Horn, and we prepared for what I suspected would be the final phase of our inquiry, I found myself pondering on Poirot's incredible skill in orchestrating these seemingly random contacts. Each interview had served to rule out some possibilities while confirming others, gradually reducing our focus to the person whose combination of scientific expertise, geographical acquaintance, and psychological motivation had enabled the construction of the Ghost of Istanbul. Chapter 8, The Final Curtain. The evening of our 5th day in Istanbul brought with it that unique sense of expectancy that always precedes the completion of one of Poirot's more intricate investigations. As a gentleman who had witnessed numerous such events during my long association with the small Belgian detective, I found myself observing the assembled company in the Pera Palace's magnificent Ottoman salon with the kind of heightened attention that comes with knowing that momentous revelations are about to unfold. The salon seemed especially well equipped to serve as the setting for Poirot's spectacular demise. The rich burgundy velvet of the upholstered furniture, the intricate patterns of the Persian carpets, and the soft gleam of gilt-framed mirrors all contributed to an elegant sophistication that served as the perfect backdrop for what I had come to recognize as one of my friend's most masterful performances. The collected guests for Inspector Kemal, who had been gathered at Poirot's request to include all of the key individuals in our inquiry, took their seats with a nervous expectancy that showed each individual was well aware that the evening would bring either vindication or exposure. Lady Margaret Harcourt had positioned herself near the big windows overlooking the Bosphorus, her black morning dress cutting a sharp figure against the waning light of the Turkish dusk. Despite the controlled dignity that had defined her behavior during our investigation, I sensed a slight strain in her demeanor that indicated significant dread about what revelations the evening may bring. Her financial troubles, which she had openly admitted during our earlier talk, had undoubtedly provided sufficient motivation for the crime. However, something about her core personality had always struck me as irreconcilable with the sophisticated deception that had marked her husband's death. Professor Rami Effendi sat in a chair that had a commanding view of the entire gathering. His scholarly demeanor and attentiveness to the proceedings demonstrated both intellectual interest and professional concern for the result of our investigation. His fervent nationalism and real anguish over the plundering of Turkish ancient riches had undoubtedly provided him with compelling motivation to assassinate Sir Leonol. However, our thorough investigation found critical deficiencies in both his technical expertise and acquaintance with the practical elements required for the complex procedure used in the murder. Captain Julian Rhodus sat somewhat apart from the others, his military demeanor visible even in repose, but his obvious financial desperation, as well as the frankness with which he recognized his precarious circumstances, characterized him as a suspect whose motives were clearly clear. His plain nature and conventional approach to problem-solving had always struck me as fundamentally incompatible with the type of creative thinking required to devise and carry out such a complex plan. Miss Evelyn Trent had picked a seat with an excellent view of Poirot, with her back to one of the room's magnificent marble columns, a decision that struck me as either unintentionally protective or purposefully designed to provide psychological comfort during what she must have known would be a difficult evening. Her academic background and scientific competence had positioned her from the start as our most capable suspect. Throughout our inquiry, she maintained a veneer of scholarly detachment, making it difficult to determine her genuine emotional state. Theodosia Karakos, whose discovery of Sir Lionel's body had sparked our entire investigation, took a seat near the fireplace, where the warm light appeared to highlight the premature silver in her dark hair and the wrinkles of care that etched her face. Her sincere faith in the supernatural explanation for the death, combined with her intimate knowledge of local folklore and traditions, she had supplied critical insights into the cultural backdrop that the murderer had used so effectively. Poirot had positioned himself in the center of the collected crowd, his diminutive figure commanding attention through pure personality rather than physical appearance. He had dressed in his most formal evening suit for the event, his patent leather shoes sparkling, and his moustaches groomed to perfection. A sartorial choice that expressed both his regard for the gravity of the situation and his enjoyment of the theatrical qualities that distinguished his most memorable reveals. "Madame and Monsieur," he continued, his voice resonating throughout the exquisite salon, "we have gathered this evening to examine Sir Lionel Harcourt's tragic death and to finally put an end to the mythology of the ghost of Istanbul, which has cast such a shadow over the archaeological community of this historic and wonderful city." The hush that followed this introductory statement appeared to weigh heavily on the assembled group. Each person maintained their composure, despite visibly fighting with private fears about what the evening's disclosures might bring. From the start of our investigation, Poirot continued, his green eyes moving systematically from face to face as he spoke. "I was struck by the remarkable sophistication of the method used in this crime. The creation of a gaseous poison in the confined environment of an ancient system, combined with the strategic exploitation of local supernatural beliefs to provide camouflage for the murder, required a combination of scientific knowledge, geographic familiarity and psychological insight helped us restrict our suspect list significantly. Miss Trent's serenity, which had been excellently maintained throughout our investigation, began to show signs of actual strain when Poirot's careful analysis shifted to the technical components of the crime. Her hands, I noticed, had developed a tiny tremble which she tried to hide by clasping them tightly in her lap. The footprint evidence from the crime scene, Poirot proceeded with relentless accuracy, proved that the murderer had intimate knowledge of the system's geography, knowledge that could only be obtained through lengthy personal study of these underground places. More importantly, the chemical examination of leftovers discovered near the victim's body proved that the lethal gas was produced by a controlled reaction involving substances readily available in any well-equipped archaeological laboratory. Poirot went on to explain with characteristic thoroughness how the crime was carried out, describing it as a masterpiece of criminal planning that took advantage of Salinal's secretive working methods and tendency to pursue promising leads without informing others of his specific intentions. The note that had enticed him to the cistern, claiming to unveil a fresh inscription of possible value to his studies, had supplied the ideal method of pulling him into the isolated atmosphere where the murderer's well-planned trap lay. Poirot's purpose, with his eyes now concentrated immediately on Miss Trent's increasingly pallid features, was professional envy of the most poisonous sort. So Lionel's statement about the finding of items related to Constantine, the great threatened to permanently eclipse the career of a rival whose entire professional identity was based on academic recognition and scholarly renown. Miss Trent's final veneer broke beneath the weight of Poirot's unwavering argument. Her confession came in a stream of harsh words, revealing the depths of bitterness and professional dissatisfaction that had motivated her to commit murder. Her knowledge of archaeological chemistry had given her both the knowledge and the tools to create what appeared to be a miraculous death, while her familiarity with local mythology had revealed the ideal way to cloak her crime beneath the veil of ancient superstition. As Inspector Kemmel's officers moved to arrest the confessed murderer, Poirot concluded that the ghost of Istanbul was a creation of human intelligence, not the vengeful spirit of legend, but the calculated malice of one woman who chose to cloak herself in superstition rather than accept the limitations of her own scholarly achievements. Miss Trent was carried away into the Turkish darkness, her academic career shattered by the same ambition that drove her to murder for scholarly immortality. I found myself reflecting on the strange ways in which the ancient and modern worlds have collided in this very unusual example. The Byzantine sisters would retire to their sweet slumber. The tourists would continue to marvel at their engineering skill, while the ghost of Istanbul would drift back into folklore, where it belonged. However, the human passions that had given it a fleeting and deadly reality, envy, ambition, and the desperate desire for recognition, would continue to haunt the hearts of men and women throughout history, necessitating the vigilance of those like Hercule Poirot, who understood that the greatest mysteries are often found not in supernatural intervention, but in the dark complexities of the human soul. And thus our story ends in the beautiful salon of the Pera Palace Hotel, where Poirot has once again demonstrated that no mystery, no matter how steeped in otherworldly lore, can survive the unrelenting application of logic and reason. What did you think about the mystery? Were you able to solve it with the excellent detective? Please let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed Poirot and Hastings' voyage across Istanbul, please like this video and subscribe for more classic mystery stories. Your support allows me to continue bringing these secrets to life. Until next time, keep your brain sharp and your curiosity alive, and remember that there are no ghosts in the world of Poirot, only the very human ability for both evil and justice.